Hello, everyone. I am Andy Nowicki, and I'm happy to be here with Matthew Pegas. Matt Pegas has just written, has just published his first book with Terror House, and so Matt, was it about a month ago, a month and a half ago that Dragon Day was published?
Yeah, just about a month ago exactly. I believe the release date ended up being June 4th, and it's now July 6th. So it's been out about a month, and I'm hearing good things from people that have read it. Matt Forney of Terror House has said that it's selling reasonably well, but I'm continuing to try and push and promote it. So I really appreciate you having me on your channel and having a conversation because I certainly think that some of fans of your book may enjoy it. So hopefully this is a way to get some new readers.
Your ticket to fame is assured, once you appear on my YouTube channel. Anyway, no, it's a great book. I read it. I wrote a blurb for it, and I honestly enjoyed it. And I wrote an honest blurb. I meant what I said when I wrote for the blurb for your book. So congratulations on being published, and since we share the same we share the same publishing house, we could be called label mates, like they used to say.
For sure. Yeah, in the music
so,
scene.
So proud to have you on board, young man. And let's start with you. I wanted to. You suggested that we have a conversation, and I thought that sounded like a cool idea. I actually, years and years ago, it seems like ages ago, I had this thing going, or I was trying to get this thing going. This was back when it was during the second incarnation of AlternativeRight.com, or when it was Alternative Right Blogspot, before it became Affirmative Right. This was like, oh gosh, like I guess maybe 10 years ago or so. I did a couple of author to author podcasts. I talked to a couple of people, and it was kind of an interesting thing, or I thought it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I don't know if anybody else did, but I had fun. Where we would talk to each other about our we would basically interview each other about our each of our books, and give each other sort of publicity and support. So this is sort of a continuation of that author to author tradition, even though it's been a long, long time. I think I only had two segments of that ever. But yeah, so let's start by talking about Dragon Day. Now, when I read your book, I strangely enough was, and I think I might have told you this already, but there's a really terrible movie from the 90s called Higher Learning, and it's directed by John Singletary. Singletary? Is it Singleton? The director of Boys in the Hood. I can't think. I'm getting him confused with Mike Singletary, the Chicago Bears great. But anyway, this is probably a movie that nobody remembers, but I remember it, and it was in a college setting, and it was about a sort of vulnerable protagonist who wants to fit in, and who's very self-conscious, and has a difficult time, and then eventually descends into insanity. And there was like a kernel of a interesting concept in there.
Yeah.
And that guy, his last name is Rappaport. I can't think of his first name right.
The director is John Singleton. Let me see. I'm trying to get this Wikipedia up. But go on. Yeah.
So he was actually really good. He was actually very compelling in the role, but it was just terrible. It was very over the top, very melodramatic, and of course, it didn't present things in a very even-handed sort of way at all.
Yeah.
And not as you might expect. Now, the reason why I mention all of this obscure movie that no one remembers except me, is when I read your book, I thought this is like Higher Learning if it was good.
Yeah.
The storyline is somewhat similar. It just insofar as your protagonist, who is this, I found very, sympathetic in this very painful kind of way. Like see somebody that you know is going on the wrong path, but you really are pulling for him to try to, pull himself out of it. But at the same time, he's kind of doomed to crash and burn, and it's very powerful. I think the way you present this character. Where did he come from for you? Is he in some ways autobiographical? Is he based on people you have known?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good place to start. I would say, and this is probably a fairly common answer to this kind of question, and perhaps it's even one that you would give about some of your work, but I would say that, everything about this main character, Toby, in Dragon Day was founded in a certain degree of autobiography. I went to a similar college of as the fictional college portrayed in my book. I started writing the book when I was 19, which is how old Toby is in the book. So certainly, when the first little sketchings I did were well founded within that autobiographical context, and certainly some of Toby's mindset was autobiographical. But obviously, over time, not only do things get exaggerated, I mean, thankfully, pretty much nothing that happens to Toby in the book is ever something that I've experienced. And so all of those details could be described as exaggerated. It's putting a certain version of myself in extreme scenarios, for one thing. And then also, there's a time element. So even though it probably was autobiographical when I started writing the book, certainly by the end, I think I'd gained some distance on this kind of character.
Okay. Without giving too much away, he has a kind of mentor / antagonist, a professor who's very well liked and highly regarded, and who is really interesting. Again, really interesting in in your presentation of him, because he appears to be the typical leftist, agitator, professor, cult of personality type of figure. But once you get to see him a little bit closer, you see, and this is all presented concomitantly with this. It's set very self-consciously in the year 2015, which is only 6 years ago, but it still seems like a deliberate choice, given that this was, the year, like when maybe the so-called alt-right was really at its zenith and was really making its presence known, and for better or for worse, like whether it's just people trolling on Twitter or I don't know, just I mean, it all culminated. I think maybe that I said that was the zenith. Maybe that the zenith was the Hillary Clinton speech in 2016.
Yeah, I guess it kind of depends on who you ask. I mean, as you said, I pretty consciously chose to set it in 2015 because I saw that as, if not the zenith of the dissident right, then at least, certainly a high point. Not that I was around for it, as I've talked about on another podcast I did about this, but it's a little bit before my time. But my impression was that was but I do remember the cultural moment, even if I wasn't very online. And that cultural moment to me was very much when the dissident right was still very underground and therefore still had a lot of power that way, in the sense that people weren't yet aware of just how widespread some of the sentiments and memes had gone and how influential it was becoming on an esoteric level. I think that in 2016, that you could say that was the zenith, because that's when it went much more mainstream and became much more well known. But when I look back on the cultural moment of 2015, I think that struck me as a very fertile ground to write a sort of socio-political novel, because I remember that moment being a moment in which the cultural left had not, they were really on a high. They really felt that they were kind of running unopposed, and that was the first year when I heard a lot of the kinds of terminology that I would later come to associate with wokeness, so to speak. And at that point, there wasn't a lot of overt rejection of it. There's a little bit of a classical liberal sort of, oh, this stuff is, this stuff is Marxist. But there wasn't yet like the real punchback, or people who didn't realize. But I think that was really brewing in a powerful way, kind of under, in a more esoteric way, beneath the surface in 2015. And that I knew it took me a while to decide on the setting for the novel, which year I wanted to set it in, but with a few years of retrospect after 2015, remembering that feeling, it seemed to be thematically right, because a lot of what my novel is about, both in terms of the political stuff, but even in terms of maybe sexuality and some other elements explored in the novel, it's all about kind of like what's below the surface. Not to get too Freudian about it, because I'm not a Freudian, but nevertheless, it deals with themes about a certain degree of repression and these things coming to light in an explosive manner.
Yes. And again, the character of the mentor slash the professor, again, he's sort of a mentor and kind of an antagonist without giving anything away. The way the manner in which he's introduced in the story is horrifying, but then he has a second he walks onto the stage of your book and does something horrifying, and then leaves and comes back, and he's apparently still himself, but that first thing that he did, the first terrible thing that he did, is kind of like, did that really happen? Did I imagine it? Was that somebody else? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to give anything away, but it's a really, it really draws you in. It's a very spellbinding sort of dynamic. The whole like the with your main character, this young man who wants to, who's looking for someone to trust, who's looking for guidance. We see everything from his point of view, and there's almost something like in that like double introduction. There's something about the professor character that is significant, in that it almost is like a two-faced kind of scenario. Like there's an aspect to everything that's going on that's on the surface, and then there's this occultic or occulted aspect and esoteric aspect to things, which it turns out this professor is a believer in esoteria and a practitioner of occultic rites.
Exactly.
And
yeah,
and it's all very frightening and blinding, but it all it comes together. It coalesces very well. So you talk about how you wrote over a long period of time. It seems very coherent. It seems like something, it doesn't seem like something that an author wrote a little bit of and then came back to and maybe forgot what he did before. And you would think that since it was written over a long period of time, that there might be more like sort of gaps in or inconsistencies in the narrative voice, or I don't know, in this or that aspect of it.
I'll take that. I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I will attribute that to because it certainly was. It was written over a 7-year period, not of consistent work, but of stops and starts, and really it
Right.
took me it took me about 7 years to write, but it took me about 6 years, I would say, to develop the idea fully, and then about 1 year to knock it out from start to finish, if that makes sense. But there certainly are, sentences, passages that date back to 2014 when I started it. But I'm glad to hear that it sounds consistent. If it didn't, I think it would be a bit of a disaster. So I'm glad that it holds together, and I'll attribute that. Not that I want to pay myself a compliment, but I'll attribute that to being good at knowing when to. And they say this, people who teach writing always say this. Like, you have to know what you have to be willing to kill your darlings, to get rid of whole chapters that you may like. But I think I attribute it to my editing skills. I think I was very much willing to part with things that maybe I'd put a lot of work into, but as the year, as literally years in some cases passed, I realized it just wasn't working for what the novel had become, because there's a lot of themes that very much evolved over time, and it's kind of I would classify the novel as a bit of a dark coming of age novel, and I definitely wrote it coming of age myself. Like, that was very much the process of it, and kind of delineating these themes within my own life and coming to terms with a lot of kind of political realities and social realities, taking the quote unquote red pill in many cases. That process kind of happened in real time as I was writing the novel, which makes it really special to me, I guess. Not to sound gay about it, but it makes it very. It's obviously all good novels are personal, and this one's certainly personal because it charted that real time development, and that's why it took so long. Is because it took that long for me to kind of develop the maturity and perspective to be able to really fully see it through. But I think in the end, I think that the themes do come together because they came together for me, and I was able to execute upon that textually, where I was able to clean up the text, get rid of what I didn't need, revise. I revised it so many times. Like, most of the work I did on it was various forms of revision, I would say. Whereas the story I'd known from the start, I guess.
You knew how it was gonna. You knew where it was gonna go. You knew how it was gonna end.
Definitely, I definitely knew. Yeah, for a while, and this might be a bit of a cliche. I had a solid beginning I liked, and I knew exactly how it would end. I think some of the first stuff I wrote was basically the end. But I didn't. I was like, I always said, like, I don't know how to write the middle of this thing. I don't know if that's an experience you've ever had while writing. That to me took the longest time, and I don't know. I think every writer is different with that. Some people say that that have a hard time starting or finishing. Maybe I'm just. I don't know if that's a thing that, like, most writers go through, or if that's kind of a me thing. Like, maybe when I'm writing my next novel, I'll find that I also struggle with the middle. But that's what I struggled with for years, was kind of connecting the dots of
how it was going to go from point A to point B. You knew it would end up at point B, but you didn't know how it was going to get there exactly.
Yeah, like, in the case of this novel, obviously it ends in a somewhat extreme way. It's easy enough, I think, for anyone to imagine. I mean, maybe not for some people, but it's easy for many of us to kind of tap into that very darkest level, right? And I was able to do that for the ending, and it's also easy to tap into, innocence, I guess, or relative innocence, and that formed the beginning of, the unknowing perspective. But kind of getting, again, moving from point A to point B took some heavier lifting.
Yeah. And as far as the end, again, I'm really not wanting to give anything away. I do recommend that people purchase the book and read it for themselves. I don't think you'll be disappointed. I think maybe this would be an interesting way to continue our conversation, though, because you end this book, as you kind of indicated or hint. It ends on a very cathartic note. It builds up to a point, and ends with this violent eruption, which is often the sort of taxi driver like ending.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to think, other sort of movies like that, or I mean, I talk
Yeah.
about movies a lot because I'm very cinematic, for
No, me
better or for
too.
worse.
I mean, I don't know if this is what you're leading to, but your book, The Columbine Pilgrim, which I did recently actually read for the first time, somewhat of a different structure, but also certainly has a similar cathartic, explosive, violent ending. This is a completely tired comparison at just 2 years old, but obviously Joker also ends in such a way, which in turn, as you said, I think Taxi Driver might be one of the best cinematic examples. Yeah, this is very much that kind of narrative. The loner anti-hero moving toward some kind of act of violence or catharsis. Somewhat, I don't know if I really deserve to compare my own work to this because it's such a great movie. Well, Taxi Driver is too, but also Mishima: Life in Four Chapters, if you've seen that, Paul Schrader's other movie, is another one I'd put in this sort of genre. Again, the outsider hero, with all that bottled up energy, finally letting it out. Yeah.
Yeah, that was how Mishima himself chose to shuffle off this mortal coil, but also many of his own stories and novels end with similar acts of violence. And what do you think it is about that? What is so satisfying about the catharsis? I mean, I guess obviously catharsis is meant to be satisfying. It's meant to be the relieving of pressure, but I don't. What do you think the draw is of that whole approach to things? Because it's something that I've noticed. A lot of my favorite movies end with some shockingly violent scene. You don't know exactly what it's going to be, but you know that it's coming, and you're highly anticipating it. And you talk about Joker, the scene, the scene where he's being interviewed by Robert De Niro's character, on that talk show, it's one of the it's like one of the tensest scenes that I think I've ever watched in any movie ever. But it's like there's a deliciousness to it. It's like it's like you can't look away. You don't want to look away. You want it to. There's something there's a certain dark kind of draw or appeal to it. What do you? I mean,
do I have thoughts on that? I mean, I'm
yeah.
trying.
What do you think that's all about?
Look, again, I don't want to sound like too much of a Freudian or too degenerate. Although if people read my book, you'll find that it definitely toys with exactly this kind of Freudian degeneracy in a satirical way. But anyway, I do think, obviously, it's hard for me not to look at it outside the lens of sexuality. I think that a lot of these narratives, for lack of a better term, could be described sort of as either as incel narratives, or maybe incel is a strong word, but at the very least, lower status, socially isolated male who probably doesn't have a lot of sex, or in the case of Mishima, is a homosexual, or has an alternative sexuality. Both of those themes are also present in my book. It's hard. I think that the narrative power. The narrative power of that, that isolated male type leading to an explosive act of violence. It's hard for me, not to look at outside of the lens of finally getting that social sexual release that they just couldn't achieve in ostensibly any other way. And I know it definitely sounds a little bit degenerate, but it's just I can't see. Yeah.
Or it's orgasmic in the same way that cathartic is another way of saying orgasmic, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because it is a climax. It's a climactic moment. It's a release of tension. It's just something very interesting I've noticed in certainly it's a draw and it's a pull in a lot of my favorite movies and books,
Yeah,
and
it
it's
keeps you strung along, and it's charged. It's erotically charged. It's
in
like
a way, yeah.
if you identify with the character, even if you would never dream of committing such an act of violence yourself, if you identify with the character enough, you want them to find their satisfaction almost.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's almost like these characters were describing, whether it's Tony Meander in your book, The Columbine Pilgrim, or Toby in my book, or again, it's the Joker, or the protagonist of Taxi Driver, whose name escapes me at the moment, or Mishima.
Right.
There's a sense that these are people who they're not normies. They can't find the pleasures of a normal man, so to speak. They can't. They can't be productive members of society, whether that means getting married and having children, or even through work. They can't live this for whatever reason, whether it's them or whether it's society. That life is something that they can't access, and so therefore they find some kind of alternative anti-hero path to doing something either good or evil. In the case of Taxi Driver, it's an interesting movie because at the end it's like, oh, he did something good. He rescued, Jodie Foster's character from prostitution. In the case of your book and mine, or in the case of the Columbine Pilgrim and Dragon Day, it's definitely a much more overtly terrorist social act. In the case of Mishima, it's somewhere in between, right? He killed himself for a cause. But in any case, this is like the alternative to the more normie, sense of accomplishment. The same way other people, get the promotion, have their first kid. It's like there's this anti-hero archetype who goes on this twisted journey to accomplish something. To accomplish something often morally ambiguous or wicked, but something nevertheless.
Well, and it is tragic. There's I mean, I don't want to I want to underscore that there's a tragedy to it, and there's like in a way you want to see your character be able to pull himself out of this tailspin, just like you would kind of like to have seen Arthur Fleck be able to find some path to happiness, but there's also something really satisfying, maybe perversely satisfying about seeing them take these paths into darkness, and the commission of these violent acts.
Yeah, I mean, with all these cases, except for Mishima, who's obviously a real person. It's almost like we're dealing with fiction, and there's this sense when you're watching or reading some of these stories like that, it absolutely couldn't be any other way. Like that was just like written in the stars that this is someone who had to go headfirst into oblivion. That's the way I feel when I'm reading some of these stories anyway, and I play with that in Dragon Day to the extent that, again, I don't want to spoil anything because I want to generate more curiosity, but I'll just say that the climax of Dragon Day, and this was also an element of the ending that I knew I wanted to do from early on. It really presents the what I would describe as like a chance or almost an expectation of redemption that is then promptly wiped out. Again, just going back to the idea, like that's maybe in real life. There are in real life we can learn from certain mistakes. But in literature, I think sometimes it's just way more narratively effective to just go for it, rather than having it be just a morality tale about he learned his lesson. Yeah.
It's sort of like where the story. It depends on your hunch or your notion of where the story needs to go. But you said you had it planned out from the beginning. And I suppose, like with the Columbine Pilgrim, I knew it was going to end in violence, but I didn't necessarily know what shape or the contours or the circumstances that violence would assume. And I don't. Maybe this is a difference between how you write and how I write. I don't ever. I've never written with an outline in mind. I've never. I've always just started a work of fiction and seen where it would go from there. And sometimes, I have found that it where the story wants to go isn't where I had initially planned it to go. But you have to sort of listen once you're aware of this thing that you're working on developing, becoming its own thing, almost its own organic thing, and having, like in a way it already exists out there, and it's just your job to find it. It's like a sculptor's job is to know somehow that sculpture is already in the rock, and it's his job just to chisel away what needs to be chiseled away to get what's something that's already there, in a manner of speaking. And that's what I find to be the case with writing, at least for me. Some people write in a much more organized way, and it sounds like you said you had a lot of revisioning or revising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go on.
And that there was a lot of text that you initially wrote, and then that ended on the, to use a cinematic expression, the cutting room floor, which is interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, some of this I would attribute to this just being a novel that I wrote as I was coming to age, and also a novel that I kind of learned to write while I was writing. I think that in the future, when I write, I think it will be much more streamlined and take much less time. But no, I really never worked with an outline. Again, I knew the ending and I knew the beginning, but I definitely every time I tried to outline it, up until the end, when obviously at some point I did sort of impose an outline and tweaked it to make sure it conformed to that outline. But for the most part, every time I tried to make an outline, I would inevitably diverge from it. So I would say that I am like you in that regard. I don't think I can really work with a strict outline, and I definitely relate to that metaphor about the sculpture. Finding the sculpture within the slab of marble. That's how it did feel to make this. And I've written other things. Obviously, I don't have any other novels out, but I've written other things. Some of them good, some of them not so good. And I would definitely say that the more that you can visualize that metaphor of turning the marble slab, finding the sculpture within it, the more that seems to correspond to your work process. That, to me, that's a sign that I'm doing something right. If it feels like I'm uncovering something rather than making it up per se, that lets me know that whatever I'm tapping into is sufficiently unconscious or just powerful, that what I'm writing is of actual quality. So I think a lot of the cutting room floor of it all had to do with that. It was like learning what felt right and what didn't feel right. And if something was a drag to write or a drag to read, I knew that it just had to go, and that I had to boil down to the truth of this story and just the relevant emotions and just the relevant story beats, which is why it's a pretty short novel. It's less than 150 pages, but I feel confident.
Novella, that's the kind of form that I myself am drawn to, is the novella. I can't seem to rate anything past a certain length, and there's something I really like about the novella form, in that it cuts away the fat.
Absolutely, and I think it's even. Go on.
I think a lot of novels really do have a lot in there that doesn't need to be there. So
They
that's actually
do,
my
and for better or worse, and probably for worse, I think having a better attention span is good, and I think people who can read War and Peace and watch movies like 1900, I think that's fantastic. But we are living, in the age of the internet, and I think that not only am I drawn to writing novellas, I also think that it's very well suited, especially when you're not a writer like with a mainstream book deal. To be able to write something that you can just get into someone's hands and maybe they'll take a chance on it if they never heard on you, and they actually might read to the end. I think that the novella is well suited to the era of lesser attention spans that we are in.
maybe so, maybe so. Um, so what are you what are you working on now? Or is there any um, what's going to be your sophomore effort? How are you going to avoid the sophomore slump?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have an official sophomore effort on the table right now because what I intend to do is throw as many pieces of spaghetti against the wall as I can and see what sticks. I'm working on a number of shorter form things right now, including I am working on a short story. I have some other short stories I could likely publish. I'm going to work on that and maybe see if something like that turns into a sophomore novel. But also, I want to do more blogging and on different topics. I'm kind of in a somewhat uncomfortable, in between place right now where I'm trying to, where I'm going to see sort of what works for me moving forward and where I should put my energy.
What do you say to people who say that they just don't like fiction, like they don't see the point of reading fiction? Because I've heard that from I hear that often, like that somehow fiction is in a lot of people's minds, a lot of people who are readers, and I think I'm thinking mainly of men, and I'm thinking perhaps mainly of men of the right who like to read. It's like I've noticed for a lot of them there's this kind of not recoiling from fiction exactly, but this kind of aversion to fiction.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
It's certainly. I mean, I've definitely noticed it certainly with men on the right who read, but even just the general population. I guess to begin with, I would say I'm, at least in many cases, somewhat sympathetic to why they might feel that way. I think that, for one thing, I think that kind of a reading culture in the United States, starting with, programs at the public library and moving through high school English classes and college English classes, is very, very, very much oriented towards girls and women and the womanly at heart. I mean, it's definitely marketed towards the NPR listener crowd.
Yeah,
but then I'm sympathetic for another reason as well. I certainly read fiction. I won't say that I don't. But I don't read as much fiction as I'd sometimes like, because I think that reading fiction, it is and should be a very immersive experience that really takes you out of your own life for the duration of time that you're doing it. And I think that, again, just the way that the world is structured right now with Twitter, with the internet, like it's harder and harder. I think this is one of the reasons why movies, have been declining in quality, and even people even like TV more than movies. I think has a little bit to do with this unwillingness or lack of time to really just lose yourself for an hour in anything. I mean, in theory, TV, which Netflix is doing better than ever, but I don't know. There's something different about TV where you can kind of just throw it on and not really think about it. But with a well-made movie and with a novel, I mean, you're really supposed to suspend your disbelief and enter into it. In most cases, and I think that it's just like cognitively much harder for us to do that with all our distractions now than it has ever been. And I think people have a much easier time reading fiction because, that stuff relates more directly to, the 24-hour news cycle, and what's going on Twitter. Like, I think it can be easier for people, and I myself included, it can be easier to kind of key into that stuff because we're almost like overdosing on reality all the time, and I think it can be hard to jump into more fictional planes. But I also think, by that same token, I think it's really rewarding to do so. I've read some great nonfiction books in my day, and I've read a lot of bad fiction, and I've seen a lot of bad movies. But when you get a good movie or a good book, I think that it enriches your life in a way that that nonfiction just can't. Nonfiction is about, for the most part, it's about learning stuff, and there's a lot of things to learn. But fiction has a power. Fiction is art, and it can make you feel less lonely. I found it can really nourish you, and in a spiritual way that nonfiction just cannot. So
that's what art. Yeah, that's what art of all kinds is supposed to do, is make you feel less alone, I think.
Yeah. But then you take books like mine and the Columbine Pilgrim, and also The Insurrectionist, which I'm sure we'll get to, and I think that a lot of the most compelling fiction I've read recently is kind of aware of this this paradigm in which we're overdosing on reality, in which we're sucked into Twitter and sucked into the news cycle by. I think a lot of good fiction, it shouldn't be. I don't mean to say that I like or want to write escapist fiction, because I don't think escapism is good. I think that that a lot of great works, and I would include The Insurrectionist in this, is able to find fiction and find art in this 24 news cycle that we are inescapably glued to. So I just want to add that as a caveat. I'm not advocating escapism. I'm advocating doing something creative. I'm not even like being a Luddite and saying we need to get off the internet. I think that there's really creative ways that we can create fiction with this. And I guess you're kind of more in control of this conversation, but I will throw in here that we also definitely want to talk about your book, The Insurrectionist.
Oh yeah, I don't have to be in control. I can hand the baton to you if you would like. Just
briefly, I do want to say that we're also here to promote Andy's new book, The Insurrectionist, which came out on Terror House Press last Friday. What was that? The 2nd. And it's a great novel. Just as Andy gave a nice blurb to my book, I gave a good blurb to his. I believe it's on the back cover. I haven't got my physical copy yet, but and as Andy said, I definitely meant what I said. I think that The Insurrectionist is a great read, very timely reflection on the post-COVID world. It's the first dystopia that I've read, and set in this post-COVID moment. And one of the things that really stood out to me in it is the way that you kind of reflect on the language used by the villainous characters and the sort of mainstream media New World Order conglomerate in the book. The language, I believe he said, like the language that engenders hopelessness and despair. This talk of new normal and all this stuff presented on TV and through the media, which encourages us to basically surrender, I think is very powerfully evoked in this new novel of Andy's.
Thank you. Yeah,
well, I guess that wasn't a question; it was more of a compliment. But
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I remember there was something on that was on HBO, and I don't usually watch HBO, but I was watching it with some other people, and there was this PSA that came on. This was like maybe in April of 2020, April or maybe early May. It was like, and it was so awful. And I think you can probably still find it if you look it up on YouTube. It was called "It's Okay to Not Be Okay."
Mm-hmm.
They even split the infinitive. It's okay not to be okay, which made it even worse from an English teacher's perspective. But it was like all of these characters, all of these personalities, saying it's okay to feel down. It's okay to feel like, and it's meant to be, like sympathetic. It's meant to, it has the appearance of being something where, they're reaching out to you and saying, and patting you on the back and saying, you're all right, buddy. But really, it's just absolutely demoralizing. It was the worst. It was maybe the most loathsome spot the worst thing that I saw or read during that whole stretch of propaganda. And there were so many things that I saw and read that I absolutely loathed. And of course, something that I make reference to in the book, in The Insurrectionist, there are a couple of news articles that are written in this sort of style. It's almost like there's a template, and you're supposed to just you stick these things into the template, and it's like, okay, what like the kind of thing you would read in some awful mainstream media source or other would be, like, who are these people who are protesting against the lockdown, and what is their, what are they all, mm-hmm. what is their psychology, what is motivating these strange people, these these freaks, or some random university professor somewhere saying, something that's supposed to be wise, but it's really just dismissive. But since he's supposedly got some clout, he or she supposedly has some clout as an authority, as an authorita, then it's supposed to be something that, as you read it and you think, yeah, that's a good point. He's really smart. He's really on top of things. And again, these pieces of media, these bits of propaganda, mm-hmm. It's like they're so cheap. They're so they're so dumbed down. It's almost like, give me Triumph of the Will if you're going to give me propaganda.
Yeah,
at least make it beautiful and sweeping, and it makes one yearn for that other kind of propaganda. That's like it may also be sinister, but at least it's like you see the you can see the skill behind it and the artfulness behind it. Whereas the kind of stuff you see like from the mainstream media and from mainstream newspapers and periodicals and from NPR and wherever, it's just so it's like it's symptomatic of the era that we're living in, where everything is again so cheapened, so dumbed down, so just. But the whole idea is again. I said this when we were on, mm-hmm. when we were both on with Matt on the Terror House podcast. I got the feeling from the start that what they were aiming at was demoralization, and that was something I really wanted to show in The Insurrectionist, because The Insurrectionist is set in a culture that's just like, if certain current trends continue, for a few more years, that's going to be reality. The world of the book is going to be reality. It's not even like it's dystopia. Yes, it's science fiction in a way, but to me, it just seems like this is what's happening now, unfortunately. Yeah. And this is only slightly exaggerating it, just a touch. But again, there is there is this push from on high, I believe, to do all kinds of sinister things to us. Of course, I'm one of those conspiracy theorists, I guess, who thinks that the powers that be are really up to no good whatsoever. But I'll just stick to the kind of stuff I'm talking about.
Even on a more exoteric level,
Yeah, on an exoteric level, there's just this. They just want to make us miserable.
Yeah. Or make us numb, as you said, like there's a big difference, there's different kinds of propaganda, but in this case, the propaganda is the world is a scary place. You too can feel like a victim. That's part of it, I think. And
it's okay to feel like a victim and to feel depressed and demoralized. We want you to feel that way.
Yeah.
It's like, join the rest of us.
What they always say about right-wing propaganda, or even perhaps even communist propaganda, and extreme sort of action-oriented propaganda, is that it uses fear to motivate action. It taps into people's fear to make them do something. In this case, the propaganda is definitely tapping into fear, but it's motivate. It's trying to rob people of all their motivation and vitality. So it's even more insidious.
Exactly, and that's another thing in the book that I wanted to that I felt compelled to reflect upon, because the circumstances in the book are that supposedly there's been this alien attack on like 55 major cities on the planet, where they've all been just burnt to ash, burnt to cinders by some mysterious death ray from space, and so you would think that in a circumstance like that, it would be like the powers that be would want to rally the people into this warlike kind of state and give them this catharsis of we've got to fight these bastards who killed our so many of our fellow human beings and our people in our own families in the protagonist's case and so forth. But instead, the powers that be, the propagandistic forces, the world government, because in my book it's become official, the globalists have succeeded at globalizing the earth, and there's a actual global coalition government that rules the entirety of the planet. They keep putting forth these notions that, you silly people out there who think you can fight the overlords, which is the name they've given the aliens, the so-called aliens. What you need to do is just sit back and let the experts handle this. And we've got we're working with the overlords, we're talking with them, we're negotiating with them, but you need to just realize your place is just to know that you can't really make a difference in any of this, and so again, it's like this demoralization propaganda. It's like if they said let's go to war, then there'd be like this again, this cathartic release, but they deny the citizens of the earth that.
And it's rather it's pathologized. We live in this moment where kind of any notions of masculinity or just any of the vital emotions are treated by the news cycle like they're the products of mental illness. As you said, like, look at all these people protesting what's wrong with them. They suffer from toxic masculinity and yada, yada, yada.
Right.
That's captured, both very visible in real life and captured very well in your novel.
Thank you. Yeah. So all of that was like, I mean, it was it was a book that could not have been written without 2020 occurring, without the so-called pandemic happening, without the all of the events of 2020, all of the propaganda, all of the just the way that things have degenerated and devolved so quickly over the last over the last 5 or 6 years, really. I mean, since, interestingly enough, since the time when your book is set in 2015, 2021 is a whole different world. It's amazing just how things have, how the last 5 or 6 years, but especially the last couple of years, in the last year and a half especially, things have just really gone so grim, and there's so much. I mean, I think maybe they were softballing things, they were soft pedaling things more, and back 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, I still think these sinister forces were out there and were still doing their thing and still had their agendas. But it seems like in the last 5 years, and especially in the last 2 years, it's become so transparent who they are and what they're pushing for, and they're so it's so aggressive, and it's so all encompassing and all consuming. I was I always thought to myself, ever since Trump was elected, really, well, ever since Trump was running, but especially since he got elected, and all during the time when Trump was president, it felt like, how every presidential election, everybody is, there's all this nastiness out there, and everybody is angry and at each other's throats, and there's all this ugly rhetoric going on. It was like it became that way all the time, every day.
I think it's a good way of putting it.
It's still that way.
And worse than ever. No, it's like I've heard it from I guess the left wing or the media perspective. They said, "Oh, Trump is a president who never stopped campaigning even when he was in office." Maybe so, I don't know, but I noticed it more from the other side, where it's like they never stopped treating him like, the man, to be taken down. Obviously, people talk. We don't even need to get into this. So we all know that this was the reality for 4 years. That Trump got a raw deal from the media, but then 2020 comes along, an actual presidential race here, and lo and behold, it is a lot worse than the preceding years, but it's a whole nother level that I'm younger, but I've never seen it in my lifetime. And just an absolutely bonkers year, and the ushering in of this, what I hope isn't a new normal. I don't know what comes next or what comes from here, but I do have some hope. I think that there's a lot of dissent in the air. Not even people that are like, online weirdos like us, but even just normies I talk to are not happy about this. So I think there's some hope, but certainly 2020 was insane, and I don't know what comes next.
Yeah, I think there's hope too. I'm not a black-pilled person. I've always tried to draw attention to the fact that, even with all the negative stuff going on, and all of the negative and unpleasant, and I think sinister and evil people who do have a lot of power, who run the media and run the every particular lever of power, the entertainment industry, the political menagerie, what have you. That's not all there is. There's always something else pushing back, and we have to keep that in mind. And that's what I think I wrote The Insurrectionist in a way to give show that there
there's hope, you know.
there is hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I think a lot of the most kind of this is to somewhat diverge from literary matters and talk about politics, but some of the most white pilling things white pilling conversations I've had over the past year, a lot of, or with a lot of sort of millennial age women actually who were probably very against Trump in 2016, but have really come around, whether because they have started to plan on having kids and they see all the insane stuff that's being pushed to children, whether it's about the trans stuff or CRT. I've had a lot of conversations about people who have decided, that they're no longer on board, with the tide of liberalism. And I've had so many of these conversations, people in my life that I never thought would have sort of switched sides have. So what I'm trying to say is I think that those conversations with mostly like millennial age women, but obviously a lot of guys too, has really underscored for me just the fact that humanity has a way of winning out over some of this, and when what's being pushed is so vehemently anti-human, even if the odds are kind of stacked against us in terms of who has the power or whatever, there is that. It's almost a cliche sort of romantic notion, but nevertheless, that there is the beating pulse of humanity will persist. Right. And I think that comes across in your book as well.
I think it's about having faith, whether it's a faith in transcendent faith or transcendental faith, spiritual faith, or whether it's just believing that good can win over evil. Whether you're religious or not, there has to be a faith component to things, to the way that you look at things. Not that of course you also want to see things for the way they are. You don't want to just be Pollyannic about the way things are, or whatever. But I would. So the best thing that came out of 2020 for me was that it inspired me to write again. There you go. To write fiction for the first time in a long time, and it definitely came. It was like it was something that I wrote because I had to write it,
we talked about that a bit on the podcast we did with Forney, about that sense of needing to write and how that really feels like it's a sort of gift. And I think it ties a little bit into that notion of chiseling away at the slab of marble to find the sculpture inside. That sense of that something external is guiding you along, whether it's God, or even if you understand it differently. I think that there is that profound sense when you're making good art. Unless you have another point to make on that, I actually. I wanted to change course a little bit. I had a specific sort of English professor-y sort of question, which I imagine you might enjoy delving into. And this ties in with the insurrectionists, but also the conversation we were having earlier, both about my book and also the Columbine Pilgrim, which is your first novel and in some ways your most famous. I noticed that there's a very different kind of hero archetype present in the Columbine Pilgrim, as well as Dragon Day, that we were talking about earlier, that sort of anti-hero who ends up doing something, basically the ambiguous hero, the anti-hero versus the true hero, the classical hero. You've mentioned that The Insurrectionist is, I think, your first work that really has that classical hero archetype where it's just a character, he's of humble beginnings, but he does something heroic. He does something sort of unequivocally good. Whereas, the Columbine Pilgrim is your classic anti-hero. He's not even, and the name is coming back to me now, he's not even Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. He's worse. Right. He's a killer and a raper. And my, obviously with some nuance, with a lot of nuance to the character, but nevertheless, that's where it ends. And Toby in my book, well, he's a little bit more... he's maybe perhaps a little bit more innocent to start, but nevertheless, ends up involved in something very bad. So to me, I think that's just interesting to comment on the kind of different heroic archetypes and why have you finally, after many books with the more anti-hero archetype, you finally felt inspired to write a heroic archetype. But also, to me, that also ties into another theme, which I definitely want to touch on, which is the idea of anger and the sort of the role of anger as an emotion. When is it justified and when does it become something perverse? I think that we were talking about earlier with the, for lack of a better term, this sort of incel anti-hero heroic archetype, or anti-hero archetype. They're led along. Again, I compared it to sex. There's something perverse about it, even if it's relatable and interesting. There's something kind of perverse, like this bubbling anger, which manifests itself in a wicked and perverse way, versus justified anger, like that's experienced by what's his name again? Pastiche in The Insurrectionist.
Oh yeah, Alexander Pastiche.
Yeah, we see that he is reacting. He is an extremely angry individual, but his anger is founded in something totally justified, and he ends up channeling his anger in a just an unequivocally heroic way. This is obviously a bit of a meandering question. I'm curious. I know that you're a Catholic, and I'm also, I'm not as devout as you are, but I was brought up Catholic, and I still go to church. And I was thinking about this issue of like anger and the proper role of anger, and I kind of am curious about your opinion as a Catholic. Like, is this a little bit like sort of the teaching on sexuality, again, to compare sexuality and anger? That I believe the official teaching in the Catholic Church is that sexuality is good and a gift. It's a natural and healthy reaction to life and to your surroundings. But then there's a way in which it can become very perverse so easily. And I wonder if anger is similar. If in the case of the insurrectionist, we see someone who has that healthy, furious reaction to his surroundings and puts it to good use. But then also, there's a way in which this anger can sort of stew if it's not adequately dealt with, and then you turn into a Toby or a Tony Meander, and you end up doing something horrid.
Yeah, I've always been drawn up until now to the Dostoevskian, like Raskolnikov, or the protagonist of Notes from Underground. There's something about that kind of character that has always kind of thrilled me, and that has been the kind of characters that I've written about in most of my fiction, from the Columbine Pilgrim through Under the Nile, through Heart Killer, and others as well. And I think and also my character in The Insurrectionist, Alexander Pastiche, has a lot in common, has certain things in common with those characters, but what sets him apart, I think, he's set on the right path because he has love in his heart. Ultimately, he's motivated ultimately not just by fury, but by love. When I think back about on all of my characters, I think that he's the only one who had the gift of love. In his life, he had someone, a girl who he, again, without giving too much away, there's some ambiguity about her. There's always a bit of ambiguity about her character and exactly who she is, and whether at one point whether she's even real or not. But ultimately, she is real, and ultimately she's real in the most profound sense that he loves her, and she's someone who, again, without giving anything away, she's someone who is sort of fated for tragedy, but and it seems is just on this path uh, where that she can't deviate from. But there's a suggestion that she actually uh, finds a way to deviate to not just be what she's been programmed to be, and what she ultimately does is she pulls Alexander out of his slump. She pulls him away from his just languishing as a junkie. Not just content to take this new cool designer drug called Zap that's been developed in the future, and just not do anything. And she this sort of a lotus eater kind of status of and she pulls him out of that, and he and without sounding simpy here or anything. I think real love is still possible between men and women.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the one character that's really what sets him apart from the other characters, and that's what makes him ultimately go along a righteous path, even if it's a path of it's a path of infiltration and deception, and he has to adopt all of these sort of sneaky tactics to get to where he needs to be to find the enemy's vulnerability, and then get himself to the point where he can act in the big cathartic violent finish, the ending. But the difference is he's I think that what sets him apart is the fact that he's not just consumed by wrath and fury and anger and just misdirected or like omnidirected anger and wrath where he just like a lot of my other characters who they just take it out on the people who they're surrounded by, because they don't feel love from anybody and they're not interested in loving anybody. So I think ultimately it's like I hope this doesn't sound sappy or anything, but it's the love story that's only a small part of the Insurrectionist. But I would say that's the element that lifts, that sort of redeems this character, that lifts him out of the mire of most of my characters, the typical anti-hero, I guess, that I have most often felt drawn to writing about through the years.
No, and as from the perspective of a reader of the book, that was my sense as well. The female character has this. She's well, I won't say too much, but she has this angelic sort of presence. And it's almost like there is something sort of sanctifying in that. And yeah, I do think it's you mentioned earlier, needing some kind of faith, and I think that regardless if that's explicitly religious or not, I think that spirituality of sorts enters into the equation here. In the Insurrectionist, there's this sense that he is on a righteous path, and there is this almost. I don't think religion is really referenced in the book, but there's this strong sense that he's doing something good. And I use this as a springboard to also talk about what I found to be an interesting point of commonality between Dragon Day and the Columbine Pilgrim, which is the sort of spiritual, I guess for lack of, I can't think of anything else to say, but satanic power that is gained kind of through anger and an angry sexuality by both Toby and also Wallingford, Toby's sort of ironic or not ironic, Toby's dark mentor that we mentioned earlier in Dragon Day, as well as Tony Meander in the Columbine Pilgrim. They tapped.
Yes.
I thought both books. And it was fascinating to me because I think we obviously I hadn't read your book when I wrote mine, and my book didn't exist when you wrote yours. Like this was arrived at independently, but there was this strong. This sort of a pot that we tapped into, like the same wavelength of the same muse, the same dark, ambiguous muse of like this apocalyptic, dark, sexualized anger that does have a sort of spiritual quality. It's explored a lot in my novel. I won't even necessarily get into passages, but it's explored as like this. It's both a sort of extremely, in some ways, ostensibly extremely right-wing, Nazi almost energy, but then also very much influenced by occultic sort of forces. And the Tony Meander in the Columbine Pilgrim, we find out in the sort of epilogue, or the I believe it's called Chapter 1 in the book, which is actually the end. Yes. We learn that he was a graduate student, enamored with Nietzsche, who'd come to this belief that he was totally beyond good and evil, and that he had some mission to effect some sort of amoral violence that would perhaps lead to a new age, which is the exact same sort of occult, dark wavelength that Dragon Day taps into at times. So it's interesting, that both of us sort of found that, whatever it is, it's like this dark, demonic presence that's out there in the world that we both, I guess, tapped into, but that's also explored in a lot of very dark philosophy and sort of post-Nietzsche, weird satanic Nazi shit of the sort that I actually talked a little bit about this with Forney when I did my podcast with him. But this stuff is out there, and we both sort of tapped into it. But it also ties in with the insurrectionists because, again, with the contrast between the anti-hero versus the hero. The hero finds some sort of righteous sort of faith. But then even if you don't have that righteous sort of faith in something higher, what you end up with is a demonic spiritualism. Like the end point, there's a spiritualism to the end point either way.
Yes. Yeah. When I first when I first began on working on the very early stages of the Columbine Pilgrim, my initial thought was it was gonna be about this group of people, this sort of crazy cult who's obsessed with Columbine and who revere the Columbine killers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, and who think of them as gods, and and like it's gonna follow them as they go around on their pilgrimage and visit all these places like the pizza place where Eric and Dylan worked for a time, or the place where this happened in their lives or where that happened in their lives, and they're going to visit the school and say, here's where Brooks can't think of his last name right now, but the friend of theirs, Brooks Book, I think, where he ran into where the place in the parking lot where they saw him and he Eric told him to go away, to get out of the school because it's he likes him now, he wants to spare his life and all these kinds of things. And I thought it was just I was kind of fascinated by the whole idea of this cult that was built around Eric and Dylan, because people like that really do exist. There are people like that out there who just who revere Eric and Dylan. There are girls, who worship, who lust after them, and it's crazy. It's so weird. But I was like on a Columbine message board for a couple of years and talked to a lot of people who were also fascinated by Columbine, and I think mixed in among that group were a few, kind of people who are kind of a little borderline that way, who sympathized in some ways with what happened there. And so so initially it was just going to be about this cult, and then out of that somehow grew developed this person, this character, uh, who who had his own journey towards the dark side, and prompted in part by Nietzsche, whose philosophy I've never really cared for, but I've always really liked him as a writer. I've
Oh
always
yeah.
thought he's a really powerful writer, um, and just very, the energy that he brings is very bracing and very
Hmm.
powerful. And so I'm just saying it's interesting, what you're saying about, there being a spirituality, some kind of spirituality motivating it all, because I think that was where my mind started when I was working on the Columbine Pilgrim, and it does, it does end up in the book, because when Tony Meander is making his pilgrimage to Columbine, he eventually meets up with a bunch of people. Like he gets on this van,
Hmm.
and it's the guy, the tour guide is like this shamanic,
Yeah.
kind of character.
I just I
Uh,
have to, but that he was one of my favorite characters in a way, or the one I found the most amusing. This is really near the here nor there with the point you're making, but I just wanted
yeah,
to add that because it's this. I'm fascinated by the idea of like this hippie, I guess sort of Charles Manson-esque image of
yeah,
like a hippie who's like all into the spiritualism, but it's actually very clear that he's tapped into something demonic and violent. I thought that was very
yeah,
well rendered. We have a few of them
yeah,
here in California.
yeah. I bet. Yeah, no. And so, yeah. So the tour guide was sort of the shaman who was leading them along on this journey of the mind, and leading Tony further towards his ultimate destination of being a violent killer himself. Um, and so yeah, I think that, in Tony Meander's case, he's got a lot of anger. He was picked on, he was treated very badly, and he feels like he felt like a castaway, an outcast, somebody who didn't fit in anywhere. And then he came back, with a vengeance, with this by embracing this demonic kind of spirit,
Hmm.
which utterly took him over, and pushed him towards eventually pushed him towards his goal, towards his ultimate end point.
Yeah.
Um, but he had no love for anybody or anything in his heart. And
I think that is the difference. Yeah.
yeah, so that's why he is not redeemed, ultimately, in any way. But Alexander Pastiche is the protagonist of the Insurrectionist, is redeemed, because he could easily have gone the same route, I think, as Tony Meander did, but he's set on the right path, and it's love that brings him closer to righteousness.
Yeah. No, that's interesting and it makes sense. And all right, we probably should wind down on time, but
Yeah,
I do have a couple more questions. Lastly, on the Columbine Pilgrim, I'm just curious because I described writing Dragon Day like it was sort of like a coming of age novel and a coming of age experience for me. It felt like something I needed to get off my chest. I did. Was that? And I think you're a bit older than I am when you wrote the Columbine Pilgrim,
yeah,
possibly. But nevertheless, it was
yeah.
like your first. It was basically your first published novel, right?
Well, I had published Considering Suicide
That's
prior to
right.
that,
Yeah.
but it was a major stepping stone for me,
Gotcha.
and it was something I published. It was something I finished writing, I think, in 2010. So I was right on the cusp of turning 40 at the time, and I actually, first got word that it was going to be published on my birthday,
Oh,
January
nice.
2011, the day I turned 40. So that was pretty cool. Um, but yeah, so it was it was a lot later, a lot later
Hmm.
than you, but it was definitely a major major stepping stone along the creative path, if you want to call it
Yeah.
that.
I guess I just wonder if it did it play maybe a similar role that my book has, or did it was it something that you felt you needed to get like off your chest? I don't know what it is. Like it's like you grow up as a certain kind of guy where you're not the coolest guy in the class or whatever, which is a lot of people's
Yeah.
experience, and like I think some of us just need to like write that book that encapsulates that feeling of being young and totally rejected. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was that, and I felt an urgency to finish it while I was writing it.
Yeah.
So there, which is something I've never felt any other at any other time. So it was
Hmm.
definitely.
It's like something you need to get off your chest, and I don't know. It's interesting. Like I've talked to a lot of guys and a lot of writers who have a similar experience. Like my friend Robert Stark, his first novel, Journey to Vapor Island, dealt with a lot of high school trauma, kind of
Mhm.
in the way that the Columbine Pilgrim does. And I mean, yeah, it's weird. It's this stuff stays with you, and you kind of at a certain young age, you sort of learn your place in the world,
Yeah.
or you feel the pain of rejection or of being low status or whatever. And I know you have a
Yeah.
book called with something like that in the title, but
Yeah.
that stuff stays with you, and you have to get it out. Whether you do it in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely. When I was around your age, I was actually in a band, so I guess that was how I was doing.
Hmm.
That's how I was doing it back then. Um, but yeah, turned to writing a little bit later. I mean, turned to fiction writing a little bit later than that. So yeah, you do. I don't know. It's just about being sensitive to being aware. You have to be aware of what you're going through, what's happening at a particular time, and you know what the muses, if you want to look at it that way, are calling you to are calling your attention to
Hmm.
at a particular given time. Um, and how old are you?
26.
Okay, yeah, so you're still quite young. When I got married at 25. I guess by 26 I wasn't really in a band anymore, but it was still around that same period. But yeah, it all comes, in it's something that can't be forced.
Yeah.
It's something you have to just uh, you can't be completely passive, but you also have to just, in a way, be patient and wait for it to happen. You
Yeah.
know?
No, that makes sense. Well, as an end note, I'd like to ask. So I've read obviously the Columbine Pilgrim, and I've read Considering Suicide. So I've read your first two books, and I read the Insurrectionist, of course, which is your latest book. But I admit I actually haven't read anything in between, and I intend to amend that immediately. But what book of yours do you think I should read next? Would be my question.
Well, I think my favorite of anything I've written is Under the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's still my favorite book of mine. So, and it was the one that I wrote uh, pretty close after uh, the Columbine Pilgrim. So I would recommend that. That would be my recommendation of where to go next.
All right, so no sophomore slump after the Columbine Pilgrim. Maybe that can give me some hope.
No. Well, the Columbine Pilgrim was my sophomore effort, I
Well,
guess.
then certainly no, certainly no
Junior
sophomore
slump.
slump there. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unless you have anything else to add, Andy, it's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you for having me on your channel. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been fun. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah.
And
No, for
best of
sure.
luck.